Welcome again to the Dodcast. I'm your host, Luke Dodson, and Greg Moffitt is my returning guest today. He is a journalist and broadcaster. He hosts the Legalise Freedom podcast, which you should definitely check out. And we are picking up on our previous conversation and talking about the topic of suicide. And as such, this episode does come with a content warning for those who may have sensitivities in that area.
Now that was a really interesting thought that came up towards the end of our discussion last time. Was about this sort of like mass suicide, not just like Jonestown type thing, but just like a planetary wise, because we have appeared all too often as a species in the last couple of years appeared to be looking like we were deliberately self-harming with a view to finishing ourselves off, unconsciously perhaps, but that, those of us who are somewhat stood off to one side observing, trying to fathom the insanity of it all, have been saying, well, that's what this looks like. This is not a collective that is mentally stable at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. You can see that in the rhetoric of movements like Extinction Rebellion, with the kind of morbid focus on this is the last generation and we're all about to die, and this is and Mary Harrington, who I spoke to some months back, raised a very interesting point, which was that it's not really about climate change as such, but it's more of something deeper than that, something more existential, a sense of futility and hopelessness. I suppose looking at it from the perspective of people like John Michael Greer and James Howard Kunstler, it's the sense of our whole meaning in life is this endless progress that we've been sold, and now that that's collapsing, people are facing a sort of ontological and existential crisis.
Oh yeah, this is very true. And we will talk about meaning and purpose, lack thereof, or the quest for, quite a lot during this session, I don't doubt, because it's central to the question of suicide as far as I'm concerned. But I think Extinction Rebellion and similar are right to identify that there's a fundamental problem here, but then forming a sort of apocalyptic death cult as a response is, for me, is a way of just kind of, it's still another reflection of this idea of futility, pointlessness, lack of meaning. So if materialist view of the world, materialist in both senses of the world, a cosmology and also a way of being in the world, another word for it being consumerist, if that were to prevail, and then what John Michael Greer and James Howard Kunstler and others, Dmitry Orlov, are talking about, then that will end badly in a material sense for us as a species. A lot of resource depletion, environmental degradation, systems failure, us being forced back to a more primitive, not Stone Age, but more primitive ways of doing things. Technology going away, a way of life that a lot of us would struggle with.
Mm.
The Extinction Rebellion doesn't seem to have an answer that's much different to that, really, or an outcome that's really much different to that. It's just kind of bringing it forward a little bit, I suppose. It's like a perverted, upended version of Greer's, was collapse now and avoid the rush idea. Which his philosophy of downsizing and simplifying your life in response to some of the big economic, environmental, and energy supply problems that we're facing. Because if we're wanting the collective to do it, if we're waiting for that, that's not going to happen. But it could end up collectively happening kind of one by one. They do say that species or people go mad all at once and they regain their sanity one at a time.
Yeah. The proposals also with Extinction Rebellion are very much focused on getting the government to do the thing that you want them to do, and outsourcing our own agency and autonomy. And it's an interesting one. I wrote an article now it was 2 years ago. It was about, or rather a year and a half ago, in the summer of 2020, about Extinction Rebellion, kind of articulating some of the things that I found dubious and off-putting about them. And some of the pushback that I received was along the lines of it's just selfish to tell people to make changes in their own life, because what about all of those people in the third world, XYZ, whatever it is, that can't? And I said, well, a lot of those people will probably find themselves in a much better position than us, because if they don't have a lot of amenities already, if they're not already hooked in to the global infrastructure in quite the same way, they'll have much less far to fall. So they're actually quite potentially, you can see some quite drastic reversals of fortune, where people in the modern developed world, where all the wealth is concentrated currently, could find themselves really, really badly off. And regions like India and Africa, which historically, West Africa, like Mali, which historically have been extremely wealthy, would suddenly find themselves in a fairly good position. I think also that the sense of that there's a certain linearity in terms of how they perceive the climate changes as proceeding, that it's just a case of turning the thermostat up. And assuming, if we take the assumption that there is some sort of warming trend, that could actually have some very non-linear effects across the whole world, that some areas could get slightly cooler, some areas could stay the same. In the Holocene warm period is about 8,000 years ago, as I understand it. Most of Africa was pretty much unchanged as it is now. Southern Europe was a bit colder. Northern Europe was warmer. So yeah, you never really know how the climate's going to develop anyway. So, but I think that there's an to going back to this sort of sense of meaning and purpose, that a lot of these people also have a sense of a global mission, that everything has to be globalized now. And so there's a panicked, and probably a little bit of a white savior complex as well. There's a kind of panicked need to have a global solution for the global problem. And yeah, I suppose that is a kind of surrogate for some sort of spiritual meaning in some way.
You're absolutely right. I mean, seeking, or rather, seeking for the governments, or NGOs, global organizations, to take care of all this, which is what they're purporting to do, and they've set themselves up to do and set out plans for. That just goes back to what I was saying a moment ago about thinking it has to happen on a collective level. This is not very likely to happen. We can see all the inertia in how these climate targets have been missed time and time again. And it seems that no matter what rhetoric there is out there, and what charts and figures that climate scientists come up with, and no matter what the protests for or against anything happen to be, no matter how large they are, the same basic cycle is run through each time with climate summits and whatnot, which is a lot of, this is our last chance. Oh, we missed it. Well, next time will be the last chance. And that also overlaps with what you said about this linear idea about the climate. And I think that this kind of apocalyptic mindset, it's just part of human nature. It has been for as long as we can see, really, back to prehistory, beyond which we don't know what the human mind was really like, what consciousness, how it really operated. But there's always been this sense of like doom, and various, temporal markers have come up in human history where this was particularly exaggerated. The turn of each millennium, for example, maybe collapse of empires. Maybe when the Roman Empire was falling apart, certain people thought it was the end of the world. the Black Plague might have been seen as the end of the world for many people. And this goes on and on. We saw it with the turn of, from when, 1999 going into 2000 wasn't actually the turn of the millennium. It was 2000 and 2001. Nonetheless, there was all sorts of, apocalyptic predictions around that. And then there was 2012. And then 2060 is another one in that sort of, apocalyptic calendar. So you have all these kind of esoteric and mystical ideas overlapping with real world stuff, very manifest problems that people don't see a way out of. But that sort of mindset is just, that's just our human way of thinking. And as far as the planet goes, this idea of the planet will be fine, it's got lots of scars. It's been through a lot worse than this. And the planet will be fine. There will be life on the planet. What it would take to extinguish all life on the planet, I'm not sure that we're capable of doing that, human beings. I think if all the nuclear weapons in the world were detonated at once and all the nuclear power stations then melted down, that wouldn't be the end of life on the planet. It would be very different to how it is now, but life finds a way, life goes on, the Earth would still be here. So I think it's going to take some kind of cosmic event, which, astronomers have predicted to actually eradicate all life on Earth. And that's a subject for another day, really.
Yeah, I topically enough, I was just reading James Lovelock's book on practical science for planetary medicine, I think, Gaia. Lovelock's someone I have some doubts about, and certainly some of the things he's proclaimed, but he's a good writer, and he explains science of ecology very well. Basically, the Earth sort of self-regulating system, as you say, has been through all kinds of very dramatic changes, and it really would take something like a massive increase of heat from the sun, as will inevitably happen at some point, many billions of years from now, most likely. I'm not sure of the exact prediction of the date, but it's going to take a while. But it's interesting you bring up 2012 and these sort of millenarian ideas. Bringing it back to the topic of suicide, one of my brother's last predictions was of a cataclysmic event happening some point in the summer of 2012. He died in the autumn of 2011, and in the sort of delusional state that he was in, had a very rapid psychotic breakdown. That one of my dad's friends, a psychiatrist who now sadly has passed away himself, who'd studied with R.D. Laing in the 70s, a very interesting guy called Mike Fielder, and he said he'd never heard of such a rapid break from reality. And in the process of this break, my brother was talking about an economic crash and taking money out of the banks, and escaping the city, and all of this sort of stuff. And it was part of this general millenarian hysteria about 2012 that you mentioned. But there's something interesting about it, was that he mentioned the summer, and I was looking back, I never quite understood why. Maybe he was thinking about the Olympics, and he was thinking of a sort of potential terrorist attack on the Olympics might happen. But now, with hindsight, looking at what's happening at the moment with the global economic meltdown, and the sort of imminent threat of inflation and financial collapse kind of all around us happening, sort of a slow burn financial collapse happening all over the place, supply chains getting disrupted by all kinds of different mechanisms. And then looking back at the summer of 2012 and the Olympics, and that creepy opening ceremony or closing ceremony, which seemed to eerily predict a lot of the aspects of the contemporary kind of biomedical health crisis. So there's an odd synchronicity there. And this is something I've noticed with suicide in particular, is that it seems to be a real magnet for synchronicities. I don't know if you found that yourself.
Well, just to address the thing about 2012, in my recent interview with Andy Thomas around his book, The New Heretics, which is all about conspiracy theories, why people believe them, what constitutes a conspiracy theory, and the how to address or deal with the extreme division that we see now in society. You know, people completely polarized on so many subjects and unable to see any common ground and just demonizing other people. We basically came to the conclusion that 2012 wasn't nothing. It wasn't a damp squib, but it was more likely, as you've alluded to, the beginning of a phase of transition. If you see what I mean, maybe not on 2012 itself. Obviously, there were things in train before that, like the 2008 financial crash. So there were trends already there, but 2012 might have been, as I mentioned earlier, some kind of temporal marker or just an upping of the ante into a phase of which we're now, the last couple of years, have seen a sort of heightened frequency, of that phase.
Yeah, I think in our conversation also we alluded to the Savile revelations and the on the ensuing seeming beginning of some sort of revelation of elite child abuse in the British establishment. So there was a sense of something shifting, and it wasn't quite what it was advertised in many quarters, but there is that need, isn't there, for some cataclysmic shift, I think, in many people, that I think it comes back to this sense of meaning and purpose, that if one's dissatisfied with one's present circumstances, I definitely remember feeling this in the run up to the 2012 thing, is that I sort of hoped that if everything changed, then somehow all the chips would land exactly where I'd want them. And that was the excitement of it. It was this possibility was in the air, and I think that comes from a sense of dissatisfaction and a kind of a lack of meaning and purpose, but also potentially there was, maybe there was some cosmic shift that the Mayans were alluding to. I don't know. Certainly there was a lot of self-fulfilling prophecies of, this is the time that everything's going to change, and people start acting like it is, and there's a buzz in the air, then you're going to find, sure enough, that lots of things change, and sure enough, we're seeing a very different world post 2012 now. It's changed a little slower than some people thought, but it still has changed.
In Harry Harrison's novel Make Room, which was later made into the film Soylent Green with Charlton Heston, more people are probably familiar with the movie, but the book's very good, and actually the ending's different. Spoiler alert, but I won't explain it. So it's set in a world written, it was either the 60s or 70s it was published, but it's set in the late 1990s in a world very much racked by the problems that we've been discussing and alluding to, but much worse. Massive overpopulation, everyone crowded into densely packed cities. The land has been, sterilized. People are eating frankenfoods coming out of factories. Everything is just, there's water shortages. It's just crisis. Something's got to give. And the part of the core of the novel is actually a detective story set in this environment. But the reason I bring it up is because towards the end of the novel, it's New Year 1999, and it's just about to flip over into the year 2000. And people are so desperate for change. Something's going to, maybe this will be it, new millennium, even though it wasn't, as I explained earlier, technically. Something's got to give. And then the clocks, I don't know whether it's in Central Square or whatever, New York, they chime midnight, and everything's just the same. Well, of course it is. But something's got to change. It can't carry on like this. But it was like, well, because it was going to flip over from being 1 minute to midnight to 1 minute past. Why was that going to change anything? And when I first read that book back in the day, I remember thinking I'd already read about 2012 prophecies and whatnot, and then about 1999 Y2K and everything else. And so I think that's what you're seeing a lot of now in Extinction Rebellion in a lot of individuals as well. And this is why I could imagine Extinction Rebellion. Sorry, I'm struggling to actually just say their name. I can imagine a subset of that group collectively committing suicide. I can see that happening. When I see them in those costumes, they look like characters out of The Mask of the Red Death.
Mm.
With Vincent Price, Roger Corman's film, which is ironically about a viral plague that eventually is unleashed upon the peasants and eventually reach the elites. But so whether it's as a species wide, in subgroups and death cults, or individuals, I can see why a lot of people, there are combinations of reasons, personal reasons, whatever, all the subset of things, because suicide is complex. It's rarely one thing. I think about 75% of those, of cases will involve some kind of relationship breakup. But that by far is not saying that 75% of people commit suicide because a relationship broke up. Yeah. That's just, maybe like a factor that pushes them over the edge. So I can see why there's a lot of people who are at the end of their tether. And this all ties back into what we're talking about, meaning and purpose. If you identify only with the body, only with material world or with material things, then it's not perhaps easy, but you can see how some individuals will reach a tipping point and they will see no way out of that, even though there's always a way through. But the point is that it seems to me, from limited personal experience, knowing a close friend who took their own life, that there's a certain zone that people enter into when they're particularly vulnerable. And rather than pretending that doesn't exist or ignoring them or hoping it will go away, or not mention or not trying to talk to them about it for fear that might tip them over the edge, that's actually a window of opportunity. Mm. And I'm not sure, I've not looked at any stats for increased suicides during the last couple of years, as things have got worse for a lot of people economically, socially, and various other, in terms of being, isolated, and also just general apprehension about the future. So I don't have numbers to hand, but, anecdotally, it is something that has been a problem. One of the many pieces of collateral damage as a result of lockdowns and other dimensions of the pandemic response from governments.
Yes, absolutely. I've heard anecdotal reports of ambulance drivers saying that they'd never attended so many suicide attempts as when the lockdown started. I've encountered a woman whose son wandered off at the beginning of the lockdown and never came back. And I believe there are some delayed statistics, so it looks like suicides actually went down in 2020 in some areas, but that's because the shutdown of all these services made a backlog. So I think it's probably caught up since then, and there is a sense of a deadening in the air. I've noticed, even though that we're both in the UK and it's quite liberal here, relaxed relatively. They've lifted all official mandates and such like at the moment, as far as I'm aware, from my last announcement that I heard. Nonetheless, that there's a sense of a deadening. Yeah, something's missing from public life, and with respect to the issue of sort of relationships and that window of opportunity, I very much know what you're saying there. So I remember in the summer of 2011, before my brother died, was having a conversation with him where he was contemplating getting back together with the girlfriend that he had broken up with, I think, the year previously. Had a very toxic relationship with this woman, and she was kind of hounding him to get back together with him. And I couldn't help myself. I just went, no, don't do that, Toby. Don't that's a really bad idea. Don't go back there. You don't want to go back there. She's not good for you. And well, what else am I going to do? What who else am I going to find that's better? And I got quite sharp with him. I said, Toby, this is not the way to live your life. All right, this isn't. There's always someone better. You're a good guy. Yeah, you've got a lot going for you. He was sort of famous in his circle of friends for being fantastically good looking and competent at pretty much everything that he could put his hand to, and very intelligent and charming. He had an awful lot going for him, but he felt like maybe this woman was the best that he could do, and there was not much else to it. And he burst into tears and just ran out of the room. I remember when I said that to him, fuck you now. But that I think, I don't know if there's anything I could have said differently or in addition to that at that time, but that seemed to me in hindsight to be that indication that something was severely wrong, and that maybe if I had foreknowledge, perhaps I would have pushed a little bit further on that and waited till we're both calmed down a bit and gone back onto that and actually spoken about it. What's going on here? Why do you feel so hopeless about the future?
Yeah, it's the exact same type of experience, which with my friend who took his own life in 2006. And I related this in some detail in our first talk, so listeners can just find it there without running through the details. The point being was that there were signs there in hindsight that were obvious, but because you don't believe, suicide doesn't even cross your mind in respect of this person. So therefore, you just dismiss any of the signals that maybe a medical professional or a psychotherapist might point out as risk factors. And you don't see them that way because, well, how could it be a risk factor to someone who would never, ever dream of killing themselves? So in that sense, I can really resonate with the experience you had. Rudolf Steiner had this to say about suicide. He said that in some ways, it's actually that suicide wants too much from life in a way that either they feel unable to fulfill all their material pleasures. And when I mention that, I think of Jason Horsley's brother, Sebastian. Jason is a person that we've both spoken with respectively in our sort of media outlets. But also that it's quite simply, and this is stating the obvious, again, Steiner said, or that the suicide has suffered some setback and, which has left them again dissatisfied with life. It's not that the suicide doesn't want to live. I think this is a common misconception. It's that they don't want to carry on with the life that they have. And that's the opportunity, if I can put it like that. Okay, I get it. You don't want the life that you have. What can we do about that? It's not that they actually want to die. Some people who take their own lives just want annihilation. But I was convinced of this with my friend Sean, that if somehow he could have metaphorically counted to 10, or if I had some inkling that he was capable of doing that to himself, that he could be here today, thinking back. And as so many attempted suicides, there are people who don't even attempt it, but they absolutely have decided this is what they're going to do, and then they don't. At some point they're like, thank God I didn't do that. Oh my God, I'm so glad I'm still alive, And I think that so many people could reach that point if their circumstances were different, if in order to allow that, just that metaphorical counting to 10, just pause, time out.
I think you're right that most suicides probably aren't, it's not exactly a will to annihilation. It's a frustrated will to life. And that you know, the accounts of these people, often they're people with a great zest for life. You know, they're really able to have fun, and often very creative, talented people as well. Well, you know, just generally gregarious, and you know, able to have a good laugh. I don't know if you've read a book called The Glastonbury Romance by John Cowper Powys.
No, I'm not sure I've even heard of it.
It's an interesting book, actually. So Cowper Powys was a poet and novelist, sort of 1920s, 30s. His book, A Glastonbury Romance, is a kind of an epic, mystical novel with all these different characters all converging on Glastonbury. And the novel ends with a suicide. And the suicide is described in terms of, it's not a will to death. It's a will to life, almost. And that the character who finally does so at the end, he does so with the conviction that this will, you know, this will intensify his experience of life. And, you know, it's implied that he may have a vision of the Holy Grail, but it's never made entirely clear. And so, yeah, there's something there that it's hard to fully put into words. As you say, suicide is such a complex thing, and it's often quite difficult to really put all of these often paradoxical concepts into succinct verbal form. But that, you know, the will to eros and thanatos is the Freudian thing. There's something of both in them, you know.
What you said about the Glastonbury thing reminded me a bit of the, you know, the Romantic movements, Byron and Shelley and all that crowd, and how life ended so tragically for so many people in that sort of that era. I don't want to call it a movement, but, you know, just the people who were wanting to re-enchant the world and the life and the universe, you know, a kind of reaction against the gathering sort of sterility ultimately of the Enlightenment, which brought its own advantages, but has left us in our, you know, thoroughly disenchanted universe that we live in now. And they, quite often through various methods, but quite often through some kind of substance, you know, nitrous oxide, you know, alcohol, opium, whatever, they had a glimpse of another reality, of a higher reality, of another mode of existence, of something that they felt, you know, that felt was truly alive, was more real than real. And they really struggled. And this was like a lot of drug users. They really struggled with the come down, which is what it would have been, coming back to this dead, dull, leaden, wooden reality. And they just couldn't cope with it, basically. But they wanted to be in that place all the time. For me, the lesson there is, and this obviously has been borne out, well, actually borne out by spiritual and mystical traditions going back millennia, but kind of lost sight of, you know, during the Enlightenment. But it's an increasing awakening in the modern era, is that these states are available to us all the time. There might be a quick route to sort of a bit of it through some kind of substances, but that some kind of realm of higher consciousness beyond our everyday five sense waking reality, 3D reality, it is accessible. It is accessible to us. And this, I'm just rereading Colin Wilson's little book, Super Consciousness, because I felt the need to do it at this time. And he speaks about that in there, you know, his idea of faculty X, you know, this feeling, this surging feeling of something amazing beyond our immediate perception, a feeling that everything is right with the world, you know, the very opposite of the suicidal drive. And this is faculty X was Wilson's version of Abraham Maslow's peak experience, you know, and this absurd good news, this just feeling that everything's okay. And these experiences can actually be induced. So, but I think it very much depends on your underlying worldview. And if you can't see the world as absolutely devoid of meaning, purpose, if you see life as tragic and pointless, then that's going to really color how you see absolutely everything. It'll just be like putting on a pair of colored glasses of, or instead of seeing things as they really are. So basically those states are accessible. So I know that's quite a lot of many points together in that little constellation of ideas, but I think that's a key to seeing the world differently. And I mentioned Rudolf Steiner, and he also spoke, and then maybe this is something we can get onto in a moment, about the significance of suicide for the parts of you that are spiritual, and that a time would come when people would recognize the significance of suicide to the point where there will be no more suicide, because people will understand the enormous implications there are beyond this life.
It's interesting. I wasn't aware that Steiner had spoken about suicide, actually.
I think it's something he inevitably got onto because he saw it as having enormous implications. He writes about life before life, life after death, and all these other dimensions of reality. So how we come into this world and how we live in this world and how we go out of it and whether we come back or not are all central to his, the anthroposophical perspective and his ideas of spiritual science, which seek to change the way we see the world. But you don't have to know about Steiner or anthroposophy to comment on any of this or to think about it, because they're ideas that existed before he came along. He's refined them and honed them. They're kind of eternal ideas in a way.
It is his take that suicide, if it was understood properly, would be avoided because it creates a sort of difficulty in the afterlife or in the in between life for those who perpetrate it.
Yes, because basically, even with a sudden violent death, someone is run over by a train or a bus, they meet with a fatal accident. There's still again, you have to buy into the idea here that there is more to life, more to that consciousness extends beyond our life in this body on this planet, that it is in fact the underlying reality. So something of us in some form is eternal, whether it has an individuated sort of identity or not, whether whether Luke or Greg survive in any way. The point is that there is a wider reality. And at death, we transition to somewhere else, sometime else, somewhere else. And that transition is significant. So as I say, even the violent death, that's a relatively orderly, violent accident is a relatively orderly transition from one state to another. I think Steiner's idea was that a suicide, it's disorderly. And basically, the irony is that the person doing it may have a materialist worldview, very attached to material things, and saw that their body as, does them all that there is. But upon committing suicide, that disorderly transition from life to death means that they kind of lose touch with their body in a way that someone who dies a natural death doesn't. They suddenly lose touch with it and then will be kind of frantically searching for it because that's the thing, that they identify with. Whereas however you die, if it's natural, even being shot in a battle as a soldier, that from that point of view, it's not suicide. So you have that orderly transition from one state to another. So he's written quite a lot about this, but the idea, I think, is that if you take, this might not be significant or important to people watching who have got, an interest in what makes people take their own lives or who have suffered because of it, in their own personal life, then this may not be terribly relevant, but I think it is very, very important to consider if there is reality beyond the 3D 5 sense one, then that obviously has to have enormous importance on how we, in terms of how we live and die. So, well, that's kind of it, really. It's just either you accept that reality, in which case you see the wider significance of what happens before we get here and after we leave, or you don't. But that doesn't actually, accepting the former makes much more sense out of the journey of life and death, and it can actually it puts suicide in a different perspective. So it doesn't mean that I described the difficulty in a life to death transition that a suicide might experience. But that's not to condemn that person or anything like that. That's just the journey that they're on. They may just have experienced tremendous unnecessary suffering beyond this life as a result of that. But there's who knows what awaits any of us on the other side, as it were. So it's not condemning a suicide by expanding the vision of it out. It's just a wider understanding of life and death, which ultimately the whole point is to move human consciousness along so that we begin to see a bigger picture, which has always been there, of reality, so that we're less likely to see this as all there is and to end it all when either life doesn't meet our expectations or we hit adversity, which we all will. And 1 in 5 people, apparently, again, not my numbers, but 1 in 5 people will consider or at least think about suicide at some point during their lives. That's pretty damn significant.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, the sense of a reality beyond the body is interestingly something that was starting to develop in my brother's last year, as he had, I can't remember exactly how much I went into the detail of what happened last time we spoke, but basically he had a mystical trip while after taking some hash of some kind, some particularly strong hash that he smoked. He was quite sensitive to cannabis, and he had a kind of a very Hindu cosmological trip where there was a sense of the universe expanding and coming into being and then contracting and dissolving with each breath. And this was terrifying for him. It was completely overwhelming. And from that point onwards, he'd always been interested in spirituality, but got particularly interested in Sufism and was practicing certain Sufi meditation techniques. Unfortunately, he was also doing so while occasionally having the odd drug experience. Not particularly frequently, but enough and close together enough. I don't know if he ever actually tried any meditation while stoned or anything, but certainly there was around the same time he was meditating and actually having these sort of peak experiences. And then, also partying with his friends and then getting a bit wasted. And then that seemed to really completely unravel him. And so what he thought in his last moments, maybe he thought that it was okay for him to kill himself because there was something else. I don't know. I have no idea. But I asked John Michael Greer about suicide, and he said that it's kind of like showing up for an appointment really early and having ages to wait around in a waiting room. That you've got an allotted time that you're going to go, and if you turn up early, then you just sort of like hanging around, kind of twiddling your thumbs for a long time. It can be very sort of disorientating for the person, but he said that there are lots of beings on the other side that are there to help people like that, which is what another guy I met who has full-on relationships with people who've passed over to the other side in his own experience, as he describes it. Very nice guy who lives in Glastonbury, really chilled out, down to earth guy that you could have a beer with in the pub, and he'd be very happy to tell you about his experiences. And he says that the same thing, that there's a lot of helpful entities on the other side, that they're there to meet people and just sort of talk them through it. The new zone, but that our thoughts about and prayers about that person are really important. And so, yeah, it's about as optimistic a picture as I could as I could ask for, really. And I have not had direct confirmation of these kinds of metaphysical worldviews, but I find them interesting and certainly plausible, and useful models to work with. And the sense that there is something, it's not wise to commit suicide. And the other thing about that John Michael Greer said was that once the person does incarnate again, and they'll be ready once their natural lifespan has already passed, so it could be quite a few years if they're young. They'll find themselves in exactly the same position in the new incarnation that they were. The same sorts of problems will come up for them that they'll have to work through again. And so it's not like we were saying last time, it's not an escape. And all the stuff that they were running away from, or trying to run away from, will catch up with them again. But perhaps with this time around, it might slow them down, but at least maybe they'll remember, oh yeah, I remember this from, I kind of have a sense that there's something else I can do, there's another option. I think that's a really important thing. It just occurred to me now, the sense of choice, that you have options in your life. And I think the sense that there are no options, that's despair.
Well, yes, suicide's an option. Not taking your own life is an option. So, straight away, your option to take your own life shows that there are options. It's just that if you think that's the only one, but if you can see that just not doing it is another option, and just realize that it is actually an option, then that expands things out. It doubles your options, for example. And that might sound like a bit of a trite way of putting it for someone who's in the depths of despair, but that's where other ways of looking at the world, or maybe even other individuals, can help out. And that's where I think, as a species, if we weren't infected with this plague of meaninglessness, that there would be a lot less people taking their own lives, because they just would see the world in a different way. I mean, as for the existence of other realms, which you just spoke about, you said you had no direct experience. That's fine, but it is borne out, even though we don't understand what really is beyond this reality that you and I are sharing now. It's a very narrow bandwidth. We can't explain it, but the fact that there is something there is borne out by all of human experience over all the human, all human existence. It's written down, and it might be all anecdotal, but it's still the bulk of human experience. The people who are most adamant that nothing like that could possibly exist are people with no experience of it. They've never had a transcendental experience. Think of people who had near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences. Some of them really hardened skeptics, hardened materialists. They've come back and it's completely revolutionized their view of the world. So the people who are most adamant that these things are all nonsense are people who have never had an experience like that in themselves, and they don't give any credence to anyone else's subjective experience. All the other millions and billions of people down millennia who've had these experiences, they just write it all off, because it can't be measured in a lab, it can't be weighed, it can't be dissected, it can't be divided by 3 or whatever it happens to be. A word about synchronicities and suicide. I'm glad you used the word synchronicity, because I've been reflecting on what we talked about in our previous conversation, thinking about having this one, because you suggested maybe the overarching topic of suicide would be meaningful one to have. And I was walking past a small medieval church that I walk past almost every day. This was a few weeks ago, and it's still very cold. And I was walking along one side of the road, and I just happened to look up at the churchyard, and an image struck me right there. And I stopped to take a photograph of it because I had to. And it was a load of graves at the back of the graveyard, a big row of them, some centuries gone by. And in the foreground, under a big tree, one single snowdrop. One single snowdrop. Now, that particular graveyard fills with snowdrops and crocuses in spring. but there was one single snowdrop there. So I've got a photograph of that in the foreground and the graves in the background. I just called it Death and Rebirth. And it was on New Year's Day that I took it. It was January the 1st. I was walking into town early on New Year's Day. And the significance of it was just, it really was synchronous to me. It spoke to me, and that's the whole point of synchronicities. Other people might say, I didn't notice the graveyard, I didn't notice the snowdrop. But for me, there was life, death, rebirth. The whole cycle was there represented in one thing. And by the way, that snowdrop is now gone, and none of the others have come up in the graveyard. So that one snowdrop came up just for a few days and then went away. On the other side of the road at the same time, just before I stopped to take this photograph, there was a sign at a bus stop, and it just had in huge letters, "Stay." And I thought to myself, oh, you know, that all this ties together, because what that means is don't go away, stay. And I thought about it in the context of suicide. Now, later the same day at night, I was walking, I never crossed the road to look at this sign, by the way. I was walking in the opposite direction, and I went past another bus stop, and I saw the same sign, "Stay." And it's only when I walked right up to it, I realized it was about a campaign for men's mental health and suicide. I did not know that in the morning when I took the photograph of the snowdrop in the graveyard. I just saw the "stay" across there, and I tied it to suicide or staying alive, you know, getting through it. And so there it was. It's a signpost about a men's mental health campaign. Now, that was all positive synchronicity around these ideas for me. When someone's contemplating suicide, they're deep into that process, they actually start, ironically, they start to find meaning in events around them, or they can do. They see synchronicities that start to confirm the fact that to die is the only thing for them.
Mm.
Silly things like a cloudy day, so they stub their toe, someone's a bit nasty to them, some little thing doesn't work out. It all gets added into the equation, the saying this is just confirming that I'm doing the right thing here. And I don't know if your brother could have experienced any of this, but sometimes they can start to see evidence for, like, negative synchronicities, evidence for the fact that there's only one course of action because X, you know.
I went to the graveyard today where my brother's buried, and I took him a single snowdrop in a little cup. So it's odd that it's odd that you mentioned that today as well. It was a kind of a spontaneous ritual coinciding with the day of Imbolc, the sort of, you know, the first little buddings of spring. That's a wonderful story that you relayed. My experience with that, the kind of negative synchronicities is one of when I was in my sort of depth of suicidal ideation in my mid-teens. I started to notice signs in the media, the films and TV programs that I'd watch, that would confirm the sense that I had, that I had ended up in the wrong stream of reality somehow, and that the only way to get out of it was death, and preferably not having to do it myself, because I wasn't really keen on the idea of having to take my own life. That bit never appealed to me. That just seemed like scary and a lot of hassle, and quite a risky gambit. But the idea of, like, just life taking me out without me having to, you know, worry about it, that was a narrative that played itself out in my head a lot. And this came about originally from watching Donnie Darko. When on my 15th birthday, actually, I saw Donnie Darko, and it sort of kind of went underground into my unconscious for about 6 months. And then my first sort of major breakdown happened, which may have been exacerbated by hash. I don't know. It certainly happened when I was quite stoned, and I had a very strange kind of nervous breakdown mixed with sort of paranoid trip. And you know, the narrative of Donnie Darko came back to me more and more in the months that came up after that, of the sense that, you know, this kid who realizes that some flaw has, some error has occurred in the wiring of reality, and he has to find a way to kind of end that particular stream and just get back to the proper one. And he does so through his own death, where he I can't really remember exactly how, but he has the presence of mind on the next time around to avoid being hit by the airplane engine that crashes into the house. And I started to see this kind of narrative all over the place. Really weird, because I never saw it before then, and I haven't really seen it since then. But I saw all these other kind of movies and TV shows that had the same sort of idea. There was a series called Do Over, where the guy didn't die, but he basically went back to his teenage years in the 80s and sort of redid his life. He had a chance to start again. And other things, other sort of indications like that. So it was like there was some trickster element, whether that's in my psyche or in reality, or a mixture of both. What even the difference is between the two, I can't say for sure. But something was finding these messages, and that was confirming the sense that, yeah, there's something wrong here, and I might have to, you know, take a leap of faith and just end it all if it really just seems certain that that's the right thing to do. So yeah, I've had experience of that as well.
I think those impulses are an indication ultimately that you need to do something other than take your own life. But of course, that's easy to say in retrospect. I read somewhere that suicide can be a bit like a rite of passage gone wrong. And it occurred to me when in the light of that, thinking about the age groups of suicide risk and indeed suicides in Western societies, you know, the sort of the ones that you and I live in, and probably many people watching this, is that many of those, what historically, you know, those rites of passage in whatever sort of society you live in, they've kind of gone away, you know, with the sort of atomization of families and social structures and what have you, and a lot of these things being seen as somewhat archaic. Indigenous societies they have it in their sorts of rites of passages and their initiations, you know, from one phase of life to another, particularly from childhood into adulthood, which I think is so important. And we don't have anything like that now. You know, teenagers just left to do their own thing. And you've got the high risk group in our societies is from 15 to 30. It's also 70 and above, but for quite different reasons, from 15 to 30. And that covers more than just teenage years, or more than just, you know, becoming an adult, or what they call failure to launch, you know, failing to become an adult. But with the increasing infantilization of young people, not often through any fault of their own, but just through what society's feeding us and what the media is feeding us, it's not uncommon for people to be living with their parents when they're 30, you know, and they've never lived anywhere else, you know, to not have a job and to be smoking weed and to be playing computer games. Yeah. You see this in the hikikomori phenomenon in Japan, again, but for socio-economic reasons, and those are factors. But I think this lack of initiatory rights is potentially important here, and that people, when they get into a suicidal corner, it can be they're trying to make a transition, or they need to make a transition. You know, they're at a point, you know, they've reached a block in their progress or lack of it, you know, and there's something there that they need to push through, but they don't understand it. Society doesn't really understand it. It's not catered for. It's not looked to. And there's usually, even in the best of families, there usually maybe isn't like an elder member of the family with one eye on their own experience and the experience of these younger men and women. You know, what does this time call for? You know, how are they? All right, the world has changed, you know, since our fathers and grandfathers' generations, but certain fundamental things are still the same. We still require, as human beings, many of the same experiences as we always have had, But we have them in the context of the society that we're living in at the time. But those fundamental needs haven't changed. So to say that you don't need that sense of bonding with, your father, your grandfather, your mother, your grandmother, whatever it happens to be, with your brother, there are these societal structures and groupings that these things somehow don't matter in an age where we're all locked away in our own, surfing the net with a load of quote unquote friends, none of whom we've ever met or will ever meet. That's somehow a substitute. It's not. And a lot of this can contribute towards, and if you Google, the internet and suicide, you see the huge problem that this creates. Of course, it all moves, increasing numbers of people, especially younger people, towards this just dead end where some of them will see a way through, they'll decide to make a change. But for many people, there's nothing that seems to be on offer, because the baseline reality they're living in is apparently has no meaning, no purpose, and it's just about getting stuff and being stuff. And if you don't have stuff, and you're not important or you're not esteemed or whatever, even though all those things don't stop people taking their own lives, but for some people they view it that way. I'm a failure at life. I don't know how to move forward. And you see that there's even the psychology of coping with extreme poverty is basically the same set of tools as coping with extreme wealth. Basically the same thing.
Right. I think this is a really crucial factor, the lack of initiatory rites. I think this is these traditions that they vary very widely. Some of them are more formalized than others. Some of them are more brutal than others. The Amazon tribe, where they have the fire ants kind of strapped to their hand, is a particularly extreme example. But there's also got kind of bar mitzvahs and bat mitzvahs in the Jewish tradition, which mark something as well. And there's a huge variety of these things, but they're all very important. And I think that there's a lack of that, and a lack of a sense of an initiation into the mysteries of nature, and the mysteries of the inner nature as well as the outer nature. A marking of this is a distinct phase of life now, and that is, that's a really crucial point. Something I was interested to get your take on is why do you think it could be that, generally speaking, it's been much higher, there have been much higher suicide rates among men than women? I know that it's rising in women now for the first time pretty much ever, as I understand, but still pretty much, I think it's about three quarters to a quarter the ratio of male to female suicides.
It was a little bit less than that for a long time. You're right, it is slightly on the increase. And I think actually there's more female suicides in China than there are male suicides.
Interesting.
No doubt there's socio-cultural reasons for that. It may be to do with emotional intelligence, or an ability to express emotions. That's would be my, off the top of my head, answer. Just how women are in their way of being for the most part, as opposed to men. And here we'd be looking to what many would see as more traditional male and female role models. So men are supposed to be strong and stoic, not really display their emotions, take everything that's thrown at them. No, blubbering and crying, no whinging, just get on with it, be strong, be there for everybody. And it's not that women can't be or aren't all of those things, but again, a more traditional role would see women as more able to express their emotions, more able to open up to each other, to the other women. And traditionally, got to emphasize that, under somewhat less of the pressures, economic maybe or otherwise. And of course, that has been changing over the last few decades. So I'd be interested to hear anyone who really understands psychology, changes in society, and suicide risk to put some details on that. But essentially, I would see that as the roots of it, just different rules, different expectations in society, and different, what people become used to in terms of what they feel they can speak about and what they can't speak about. Because there's fundamental differences to how men and women's brains are wired. As much as we have in common, human beings, there are certain fundamental differences, no question about that.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think a lot of the time there's different forms of emotional processing too that go on. So I think that I can see some of the campaigns to kind of encourage men to talk about their feelings more. I see they have a good intention, and maybe in some cases they have some good results. I know there have been some campaigns to do with male suicide that have actually decreased the suicide rates in certain local areas. So that I don't know exactly what techniques they were using, but a lot of the time I think that there is, there are these events, about encouraging men to kind of open up and talk about their feelings and such like, and a lot of them are kind of mostly attended by women, and so it's kind of not doesn't seem to be very popular among men. And I speak as someone who's had experiences of psychotherapy myself, that I think sometimes it can be a bit more useful for men to kind of express their emotions in a context of completing a shared task together, and that sort of that sense of trust and bonding can then open up the way for a more, perhaps more verbal sharing, and even more kind of, actually getting out some of that emotional charge in the process of doing something, like putting together.
There's some really fascinating, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. There's some really fascinating inter-male dynamics in a couple of my favorite films from the 70s. I'm smiling just because it's sort of darkly comic at some points, but just highlighting just some of the ways that men interact in small groups when they're doing particularly physical things and women are not around. You see this on a micro scale. If a few guys get together at a social gathering and they've gone out to the garden to light the barbecue and the women are inside making the salad. Cliche alert, but this dynamic starts already. And these two movies there's one called, they're both dark, violent movies. One's called Deliverance by John Boorman. And this features a small group of city guys who go deep into the wilderness on a hunting, fishing, and outdoors kind of expedition. And their skills range, they were quite different guys, but their skills range from the very competent outdoorsman who's got all the requisite skills through to there's four of them. One guy who's doesn't really know what he's doing. He's just along because this is an exciting thing for guys to do together. As I say, there's some awful violent tragedy in that film, but the interesting bits for me are watching these guys interact with each other when things are going well and when they turn nasty. And then there's also The Deer Hunter, which is a very famous film about the Vietnam War. And it's when the guys go together into the wilderness on a deer hunt. And it's all their interactions together in that sort of, again, in both Deliverance and The Deer Hunter, to a greater extent or less, they're pitted against nature in some way. And I think that's very interesting because it's like this archetypal environment for a male challenge. And then it puts pressure on them in terms of their interactions. So they're forced to interact more with each other or to be more emotional or not. So they just popped into my head because I find it difficult to get through any talk without giving pop culture references. I just something that I do, I just think it's an interesting lens to look at things through. So yeah, even if you just go on YouTube and pull up some clips, it's just fascinating watching small groups of men doing what they do, challenging themselves when it's an all male environment.
I know the film Deliverance. I've never actually watched it, but my great uncle edited it, and so he was out there with when they were filming it, and anecdotally the scene where the little kids playing the banjo, the dueling banjos with the other guy, that actor, he had another guy behind him whose hands were playing the banjo that he was playing on that one. So that's how they shot that. Basically, they had like a master banjo player that was playing the banjo for this guy. But yeah, I think it's true. It is a very archetypal experience, and like something like a film like Deliverance kind of shows that the sort of the darkest possible uh, uh, kind of result of that of that archetypal challenge.
Having known female friends over the years, when they've hit rock bottom and been in really difficult times, I'm generalizing here, so I'm not thinking of any specific conversation, but a conversation with a woman having a really difficult time and the idea of suicide, generally it would be, oh, no, I could never do anything like that. Think of other people. I would never do that to my family and friends. That's not what I want. There's always a way through it. That I would never do that. It's the ultimate act of selfishness. And they would see themselves still, not in all cases, but again, just in my experience, ultimately as not completely alone. And thinking about the same types of conversations with men is that they would understand what suicide leaves behind up to a point, but they would see themselves in that moment as utterly alone. And that there just was no other, just completely blinkered, and just alone in this world, alone in the next, just cosmically, completely abandoned in darkness.
Carl Jung and Marie-Louise Lanfrance, his student, had some quite interesting ideas about suicide, which they related to the animus archetypes in men and women. And that I think it's von Franz in Man and His Symbols, where she uses a Siberian folktale of a man who's lured across a river by a beautiful maiden, who then when he's taken all his clothes off and he swam across this cold river, she then turns into an owl and flies off, and then he's stuck on this river and then he drowns. And she uses that as a folktale, folkloric symbol of the possession of the anima, which in their terms was the sort of the quote unquote feminine aspects of a man's psyche. So that would be, broadly speaking, the kind of emotional aspect, the eros rather than the logos, and that a man who's possessed by that within himself, that is too unconscious. And I suppose this comes back to a sense of emotional repression as well. It's quite compatible with that, because the whole one of the fundamental points of their psychology was that what is unconscious will end up driving the person if it's not rendered conscious. So that emotionality, that those extremes of emotion that in their terms an anima possessed man will get into, will in some cases actually drive him to suicide. It's interesting, synchronistically speaking, that that particular Siberian folktale features an owl, which was an animal that my brother saw in the daytime in his last few months, which he found quite striking as an omen, and also the river aspect of it as well. But yeah, I'm still working through. As I said, I've been writing this piece on suicide, and it's like this piece of string that I keep I keep pulling on, and then there's more and more and more, and it's quite a challenging thing to write in itself anyway. But there's so many different aspects to it, but there is something there, I think, that's worth looking into, of that sense of a complete possession by that sort of intense emotionality, whereas a woman may find it much easier to render that emotional content conscious and verbalize it, and articulate it very quickly, and then process it out. It seems also that women get over PTSD quicker than men, which is an interesting one as well.
Oh, wasn't aware of that, but it doesn't surprise me in a way. Some of the factors we mentioned will have an effect on that, no doubt. But yeah, that's a new one for me. I was reading a story. I'm about to do an interview with the psychologist Steve Taylor about his new book, Extraordinary Awakenings, which is basically people who've had life-changing events, basically transformation through trauma. I haven't read the book yet, so I don't know if any of these people came close to taking their own lives, but it's about how you can reach breaking point and break through. And he relates the story of Mark Lanigan, a musician, and he was a member of the band The Screaming Trees back in I was never aware of them at the time, late 80s, early 90s, but he'd been a heavy drinker from when he was a young man. And then he got into heroin use, and after the band split up, he basically became homeless for a while. And he reached the absolute depths of despair, to the point, like so many of the people that we're talking about, it just couldn't go on any longer. And the manifestation for him was, as he relates in his memoir, was, I don't know if he was lying on the ground in some street or something, but he just looked up at the sky and said, "God, change me." And, and it happened for him, and he's still here being recording albums. As far as I know, he's been sober for many, many years. But it was, and you read about this, if you read the story of, I can't remember the guy's name, the founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, and one of the guys that he worked closely with.
Who was it?
The founder made it through, and he had that crying out to God moment, for help. And one guy he worked closely with later redescended into alcoholism and died, and that was just contrasting fates, But I was just interested reading about Mark Lanigan's story, and this is common with lots of people with heavy substance abuse. That affects their psychology in itself. You can end up in a suicidal position, not through any previous psychological difficulties or even physical difficulties or any life events, but simply through altering your physical and emotional and mental chemistry and makeup with substances. This is why they're to be treated with such reverence or care, and in some cases disdain. These are. I mention this again because when it comes to suicide cases, it's very common to have some kind of substance involved, not just in the suicide act itself or suicide attempt itself, but in the lead up, contributing to adding to existing problems or creating problems where there were none already there. And when I talk about suicide attempts, by the way, it's worth mentioning that if there's getting on for 1 million suicides a year, there are between 10 to 20, I don't know why it's such a wide variation in the figures, between 10 to 20 million attempts that leave some kind of problems behind.
Yes, I mean the addition of substances to an already kind of addled body and mind, when someone's going through depression, anxiety, trauma, and all the rest of it, a tiny toke on a spliff can send someone around the bend. This is what happened to my brother. That's a fairly extreme example, and that's quite rare, I think, but it's certainly not uncommon that some form of sustained abuse or some very, very cataclysmic individual experience in some cases, and this is more the case with like the psychedelic family of drugs, where some really, really intense trip has rewired someone, and they've not been able to integrate it fully. So yeah, I mean, these things, as you say, they need to be treated with a great deal of caution and respect. If they're dealt with at all. And that's something that, you know, this is applies to any form of substance, even coffee, you know, to some extent, to it's fairly mild comparatively, but caffeine can be a contributing factor to a psychotic episode in itself, you know.
Well, I don't know how much more time we've got left, but I just wanted to throw in, we were talking about mind altering substances, and I always sound a note of caution about antidepressants because these things can cause a great deal of problems. The very fact that on many of the most most commonly used branded antidepressant products, that in the notes, the copious notes, warning you of possible side effects, that pretty much the universal one is suicidal thoughts, seems rather curious. But I would just caution anybody. I mean, lots of people will say, I can almost feel the virtual pushback already. Antidepressants helped me immensely. They got me through this, that, and the other thing. Yes, that can happen. But I just know that antidepressants are not something to just be reached for like a bottle or like, a spliff or whatever. They're not just something to be, it's not a route to go down without serious thought. And I think today, I'm just looking at the epidemic of problems with antidepressants, particularly in the US. These things are being prescribed like candy to even quite young children, and we're storing up enormous problems for the future. It's not an answer. There is no quick fix, and antidepressants may be the bridge that someone can use to push through a situation. But yeah, just handle with care.
Absolutely. Yeah. And something that can be applied, as you were saying earlier, to any mind altering substances, really, and yeah, I had an email today actually from someone who's interested in taking ayahuasca, and they had heard that I'd had some experience of psychedelics, and were asking me for my advice on that. And I've never taken ayahuasca, and at this point don't really feel too much inclination to do so. So I just said, look, just take things with care. Write down your experiences as much as you can. But beyond that, I can't really say. I can't encourage or discourage anyone from doing these things. I've had my own experimentations with psychedelics and cannabis and things that we touched on in our email with Jason, and those have been fairly mixed, and we could probably do a whole other podcast about those.
Yeah, obviously a subject for another day, really.
Cool. Well, we're getting on to about an hour and a half, so yes, I'd say we covered a lot of ground there. It's been really great to touch base with you again.
No, it's been wonderful. I just leave with a thought that again, I I heard this on a online talk a few weeks ago, and then literally I was just getting ready to do this chat with you, and I was listening to another talk, and exactly the same thought came up. So I don't know where it originates from, but if particularly people in a dark space, think about themselves, as we all are, like in a way, like the sun, and the things that pass by in life, they never stay forever, and they're like clouds and bad weather and pollution. And these things can obscure the sun, but they never touch it. They never even come near it, So we have a kind of like an inner core, an inner light, whatever your worldview or cosmology is, or whatever you think of life, death, and if there's anything beyond this physical realm, there's something at the core of us that nothing else can touch that's always there, and that's what we understand. We see it clearly in the best times in our lives, those peak experiences at Faculty X. And as I mentioned earlier, that's accessible all the time. So just remember that the clouds, the pollution, all of that just blows past sooner or later. And it's not what we are, and it can't touch us.
Beautifully put. Beautifully put. I've been working through a book called The Cosmic Doctrine by Dion Fortune. And, there's a lot of that old esoteric maxim that as above, so below, that, we are our own microcosmos. So, that's always worth remembering for those who are having a rough time, that there is an internal sun that exerts its own gravitational pull, and these things will pass.